Hello, my darlings. Madame Raven here with another wonderful tale for you, this time by MellotronSymphony, entitled Never Look in Its Eyes. "Don't stay out late, or Herne the Hunter will get you," my gran would always shout to me and my sisters. We never quite knew why it was such bad news to meet Herne the Hunter, but we always made sure we'd never find out for ourselves. It's a bit like that Bloody Mary game where you stand in front of a mirror and chant her name 3 times in the hope that she will appear. No one really believes it, but no one is willing to try it, just in case the threat of Herne the Hunter was enough to keep us from venturing out too far into Windsor Forest. One particular evening, though, when we were getting at a more rebellious age, my sisters and I stayed out into the forest until it was almost pitch black. We heard Gran angrily calling for us and made our way back. We got back to Gran's house in a few minutes and found her inside the living room. "What time do you call this?" she asked sternly. Cue us staring at our shoes. "I was just about to come out and look for you," said Gran, picking up the scarf she was crocheting. "We came back as soon as we heard you call," my eldest sister said, as if it would pacify Gran. Gran's busy crocheting fingers suddenly froze. She cleared her throat and began crocheting again as if nothing had happened. "Well, make sure it doesn't happen again," she said rather croakily. We children shared a glance as we all noticed Gran's little turn. My eldest sister, who was a little bolder than the rest of us, said with a smile, "That Herne the Hunter is a nice man." Gran suddenly shot out of the chair, and though she was a diminutive woman in that moment, she seemed to tower over us. "Jay! Never joke like that!" Gran glided up to the window facing the forest and gave a fearful glance into the darkness before drawing the curtains. Upon seeing our confused faces, she made back for her chair and slowly sat down. "Sit down, all of you. I know it's soon your bedtime, and perhaps it's not the right time to tell you this, but you're all old enough now. Even you, Elle," she said, looking at me. My sisters and I sat on the floor in front of Gran, who resumed her crocheting for a few silent minutes before she began to speak. "Windsor Forest is haunted. Its name is Herne the Hunter. When I was little, around your age," she said, motioning at me again, "my father told me the legend, and that's what I assumed it was, just a silly story. My father, your great-grandfather, loved all those stories. He'd tell us them all before bed and scare us stiff." She gave a fond smile at the memory. Her face went serious again. "Many stories exist as to who Herne the Hunter is. One story tells that he was a hunter, a man, that killed a stag and had to wear the horns on his head as pendants. But no, for me, Herne is a lot older. Herne was never a man, but something else. It's from beings like Herne that the image of the devil comes from. My father described Herne as a cross between a stag and a man, with a bit of goat thrown in for good measure. It's tall, at least halfway between 6 and 7 feet. Its feet are cloven, like hooves. Its legs are covered in brown, shaggy hair, all the way up to its waist. Its head is almost human, but shaped more like that of a deer or stag. Its eyes—" "Never look at his eyes." "Why?" Gran shook her head, not as if she were imagining, but as if she were remembering. "They're big, white, glowing, piercing. The pupils aren't round. They're like letterboxes, like a goat. Even when it's looking into your eyes, you're never quite sure where those eyes are looking. Gran shuddered. Never, 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 never must you look in its eyes. If you look in the eyes, then you are its. It can have you. It can be standing right in front of you, talking to you. It can sound kind, even friendly, but never look into its eyes. It's a trick. It likes young girls like you. Gran paused for a moment. It doesn't have a voice of its own. When it speaks, it does so with the voice of people that have looked into its eyes. She looked hard at us after saying that. Like I said, I never really believed my father. It was only afterwards that I realized with what conviction he had told me the story of Hearn. It was a few months later when I realized. We were all silent, waiting for Gran to continue. I loved walking in the forest by myself. I've always had a bit of an independent streak. Another gift from my father. I was out far later than I thought, and you know how quickly it gets dark in the forest. I heard my father calling for me, so I followed his voice. It was then I noticed how quiet the forest had become. No tweeting birds, no wind in the trees, not so much as a bumblebee. The only sound was my father's voice. I wondered why my father had come out into the woods, as I'd stayed out much later on other occasions, but it didn't worry me too much. Not until I saw it. She paused. It wasn't my father. There was a man, a very tall man, standing out amongst the trees. I couldn't make him out exactly, as if he was bathed in shadow, but I could tell that there wasn't something quite right about him. It didn't look quite as if it were really there, if that makes sense. Rather, it seemed to flicker, like a VHS tape that's been paused. "Ah, there you are," came my father's voice. It held out its hand from beneath the shadow, and I saw how dark its skin looked. I stopped in my tracks, just staring at this thing. It used my father's kindly voice. It's hard to remember what it said exactly, but it was telling me not to be afraid and to come home with it. I took a few steps backward and it followed. Once it stepped out of the shadow into the dim light of late evening, I got a proper look at it. She screwed her eyes shut. The memories were not easy to recall. His eyes, she said with horror. Those eyes. So glowing, so staring, so evil. Gran snapped her eyes open. So I ran as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear it not far behind. At first it let out a terrible cry, like that of a cow in the slaughter. It followed with pounding thuds behind me. At one moment I could hear the rattle of chains, but I made it home. My father locked me in my bedroom. I first thought because I'd been naughty, but I realized now that wasn't why. He asked me again and again if I'd looked into its eyes, and I lied that I hadn't. I couldn't tell. I could tell he didn't believe me, though. Gran was quiet for a moment. It was a long while before I was allowed in Windsor Forest on my own. Not that I was keen to hang around there anyway. Did you ever see it again? No, I've heard it. The rustling of leaves, the pounding of horses' hooves in the night, and the rattle of heavy chains. I've heard a few knocks on the front door in the middle of the night, and once or twice heard your grandfather's voice. Here she made the sign of a cross. But when that does happen, I recite the Lord's Prayer and it goes away. You must do the same, she said sternly. I don't mind you playing in the forest. It doesn't normally come out in the day, but you must never, ever stay out after dark, or Herne the Hunter will get you. But if you do chance to meet it, it can't do anything unless you look in its eyes. Never look in its eyes. Now, off to bed with all of you." So quoth this raven.